The 72-year-old man's body convulsed on the Main Street sidewalk, his weathered hands clawing at the concrete as electrical currents coursed through him. Beside him, an 800-pound Black Angus bull lay motionless, steam rising from where the taser barbs had struck his massive flank. This wasn't supposed to happen to a decorated Vietnam veteran walking his guide animal to the library. Margaret Hayes dropped her armload of books, the thud echoing off storefronts as she screamed, "Bobby! Oh God, somebody help them!" Cell phones lifted like a forest of digital witnesses, recording everything. The bull's labored breathing mixed with the old man's gasps created a symphony of suffering that would haunt Willowbrook forever. What the crowd didn't know was that this bull held the key to a dead girl's final wish and her grandfather's will to live. "Get that ambulance here now!" someone shouted. But the real rescue was already thundering down Highway 9. Military convoy, 7 minutes out, racing toward a secret that would shatter everything this small Montana town thought it knew about love, loss, and the price of redemption. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Robert Bobby Mitchell had walked this same route down Main Street every morning for the past 2 years, ever since the doctors finally admitted there was nothing more they could do for his eyes. The shrapnel from that Viet Cong mortar round in 1971 had taken more than his sight. It had stolen his independence, his dignity, and very nearly his will to live. But Ranger had given him back something precious: the ability to move through the world without fear. The massive Black Angus bull walked beside him with the patience of a saint, his enormous head lowered just enough that Bobby's weathered hand could rest against the warm neck. At 800 pounds, Ranger was an unusual sight on the streets of Willowbrook, Montana, but the townspeople had grown accustomed to the pair. Most understood that this wasn't just a stubborn old man's eccentricity. This was survival. Bobby's 40-acre ranch sat 3 miles outside town, mortgaged to the hilt and facing foreclosure in 48 hours. The medical bills from his war injuries had mounted like snowdrifts against a barn door, $847,000 and climbing. His checking account held exactly $23, barely enough for a loaf of bread and a can of coffee. At 72, with no family left and a body that betrayed him daily, Bobby Mitchell was living on borrowed time in more ways than one. The morning routine never varied. First stop was Hayes Memorial Library, where Margaret "Maggie" Hayes kept a bag of apples specifically for Ranger. At 68, Maggie was one of the few people in town who remembered when the Mitchell Ranch ran 500 head of cattle and Bobby's late son had been the high school football star. She'd lost her own husband to COVID 2 years back and understood the particular loneliness that came with outliving the people who made life worth living. "Morning, Bobby," she would say, scratching behind Ranger's ears like he was an oversized dog. "How's our boy today?" Ranger would accept his apple with the gentle mouth of a creature twice blessed with size and temperament. The bull had come from Bobby's neighbor's herd, selected not for his bloodline or market weight, but for something indefinable, an intelligence in his dark eyes, a calmness that seemed to extend beyond normal bovine behavior. What nobody in Willowbrook knew, what Bobby himself barely whispered in his darkest moments alone on the ranch, was that Ranger hadn't originally belonged to him. The bull had been Emma's project, his granddaughter's 4-H champion and beloved companion. Emma Mitchell, 16 years old and beautiful as a Montana sunrise, had died 2 years ago in a car accident on Highway 9. She'd been coming home from the county fair, first-place ribbon still pinned to her jacket, when a drunk driver crossed the center line and ended everything that mattered in Bobby's world. Ranger was all he had left of her, and some days the bull felt like the only reason Bobby Mitchell bothered to wake up at all. The morning had started like every other for the past 730 days. Bobby woke at dawn, felt for Ranger's warm presence beside the bed, and began the careful ritual of navigating a world he could no longer see. The bull's soft snort told him it was time to move, time to face another day of pretending that everything was normal, when nothing had been normal since Emma died. They made their way through town at the same measured pace they always did, Bobby's white cane tapping a familiar rhythm against the cracked sidewalk. The Montana autumn air carried the scent of dying leaves and wood smoke from chimneys already pressed into service against the morning chill. Ranger's massive hooves struck the pavement with the steady cadence of a metronome, each step deliberate and sure. The first stop was always Maggie's library, but today something felt different. Bobby could hear hushed conversations that stopped abruptly when he and Ranger approached. Car doors slammed with unusual force. Footsteps hurried past without the customary greetings he'd grown accustomed to receiving. "Morning, Maggie," he called out as they reached the library steps. The familiar sound of her voice always brought him comfort, a reminder that some kindnesses survived even in a world that seemed increasingly hostile to anyone who didn't fit its narrow definitions of normal. "Oh, Bobby." Maggie's voice carried a tremor he hadn't heard before. "I'm so glad you made it today. There's been some talk." She handed Ranger his apple, but her movements were quick, nervous. The bull sensed her anxiety and pressed closer to Bobby's side, a gentle reminder that he was there, that he would always be there. "What kind of talk?" Bobby asked, though part of him already knew. In small towns, whispers had a way of growing into avalanches. Someone had complained. Someone always complained. "Mrs. Henderson called the police station yesterday," Maggie said reluctantly. "She said having Ranger on Main Street was dangerous, said what would happen if he spooked and hurt someone." Bobby felt his jaw tighten. Mrs. Henderson had never liked the Mitchell family, not since Bobby's son had dated her daughter in high school and broken her heart. Some grudges in small towns lasted generations. "Ranger's never hurt a soul," Bobby said quietly. "Emma trained him better than any dog I've ever seen. He's got more sense than most people I know." The mention of Emma's name hung in the air between them like a prayer and a wound. Maggie reached out and touched Bobby's arm, her fingers gentle against his worn flannel sleeve. "I know that, honey. We all know that, but the law's the law, and Officer Mason's new to town. He doesn't know you like we do, Derek Mason." Bobby had heard the name but never met the man. Word was he'd transferred from somewhere down south, some kind of scandal that nobody talked about directly, but everyone seemed to know pieces of. In Bobby's experience, men who ran from their problems usually brought those problems with them like invisible luggage. They finished their library visit without incident, but Bobby could feel eyes watching them as they made their way toward the post office. Whispers followed in their wake, conversations that died the moment he came within earshot. Ranger's muscles had tensed beneath his hand, the bull's natural protective instincts responding to threats Bobby couldn't see but could certainly feel. The confrontation came as they approached the corner of Main and 4th Street, right in front of Austin National Bank. Bobby heard the squad car before he saw it, the distinctive rumble of a police cruiser's engine cutting through the morning quiet like a blade through silk. The car door slammed with authority and aggression. Heavy footsteps approached with the measured gait of someone accustomed to compliance, someone who expected his presence alone to resolve whatever situation he'd been called to address. "Sir, I need you to stop right there." The voice was young, maybe mid-30s, with an edge that spoke of barely controlled tension. Bobby halted immediately, his hand finding the familiar comfort of Ranger's neck. The bull had positioned himself protectively, not aggressively, but with the quiet confidence of a creature who had never backed down from defending what he loved. "I'm not moving, officer," Bobby replied, keeping his voice level despite the spike of anxiety that shot through his chest. "I'm a veteran. I'm blind. This is Ranger, my guide animal." "Guide animal?" The skepticism in Officer Mason's voice was sharp enough to cut glass. "Sir, that's not a service animal. That's livestock. That's a public safety hazard." Around them, Bobby could hear the subtle sounds of a gathering crowd. Footsteps on sidewalks, car doors closing, the electronic chirp of cell phones being activated. In the age of social media, every confrontation was potential entertainment, every moment of human drama fair game for viral consumption. "Officer," Bobby tried again, "my name is Robert Mitchell. I live on the ranch 3 miles out on Highway 9. Ranger's been helping me get around town for 2 years now. Ask anyone here. We've never caused any trouble." But Officer Derek Mason wasn't listening to reason. He was looking at an 800-pound bull on a public street, and all he could see was liability, danger, and a stubborn old man who refused to follow basic common sense. The morning that had started like every other was about to become the day that changed everything. Officer Derek Mason's hand trembled as it hovered over his service weapon, though he told himself it was from adrenaline, not fear. The massive bull stood between him and the old man like a living wall of black hide and muscle, its intelligent brown eyes fixed on Mason with what looked disturbingly like judgment. In his 3 years of law enforcement, Mason had never encountered anything like this situation, and his training manual had certainly never covered how to handle an 800-pound animal in the middle of Main Street. "Sir, I need you to move that animal away from the public area immediately," Mason commanded, his voice carrying the authority he'd been taught to project even when uncertainty gnawed at his gut. "We've had complaints about public safety, and I can't allow this to continue." Bobby's weathered face remained calm, but his fingers tightened on Ranger's neck. The bull's massive head had lowered slightly, not in aggression, but in the protective stance that Emma had trained into him during those long afternoons in the pasture. Even without sight, Bobby could feel the tension building around them like electricity before a thunderstorm. "Officer, this bull isn't dangerous," Bobby said, his voice carrying the patient tone of a man who had explained this same thing countless times. "He's been my companion for 2 years. Ask Maggie Hayes. Ask Dr. Thompson at the vet clinic. Ask anyone in this town. Ranger's gentler than most dogs." But Mason wasn't hearing the words. All he could process was the liability, the potential lawsuit, the career-ending headline that would read, "Police Officer Allows Bull to Injure Civilians." His supervisor had made it clear when he transferred to Willowbrook that he was already on thin ice, that one more incident would end his law enforcement career permanently. The crowd was growing larger now, drawn by the spectacle of a police cruiser and the unusual sight of the confrontation. Mrs. Henderson stood near the bank entrance, her arms crossed with satisfaction, clearly pleased that her complaint had finally been taken seriously. But others in the gathering crowd wore expressions of concern and confusion. These were people who had watched Bobby and Ranger make this same walk for 2 years without incident. "That bull's never hurt anyone," called out Jim Rodriguez from the hardware store. "Leave the old man alone." "This is ridiculous," added Sarah Thompson, the town veterinarian who had treated Ranger for minor injuries and knew his temperament better than anyone. "That animal is as docile as they come." Mason felt the pressure of multiple eyes on him, phones being raised to record whatever happened next. Social media had turned every police interaction into potential viral content, and he could already imagine the headlines if he backed down now. His authority was being questioned publicly, and in small-town policing, authority was everything. "Sir, I'm going to ask you one more time to control your animal," Mason said, his hand moving to his taser. "If you cannot or will not comply, I'll be forced to take action." The threat sent a ripple of unease through the crowd. Maggie Hayes pushed forward, her voice sharp with indignation. "Derek Mason, you should be ashamed of yourself. This man served his country and lost his sight defending our freedom. That bull is his lifeline." But Mason's focus had narrowed to tunnel vision, the way it always did when stress overwhelmed his judgment. He saw only the potential threat, the massive animal that could easily injure someone if it decided to charge. What he couldn't see, what his limited experience and prejudices blinded him to, was the profound bond between the old veteran and his unlikely companion. Ranger sensed the escalating danger before anyone else. The bull's enhanced senses, developed through years of caring for a vulnerable human, picked up the chemical signatures of fear and aggression that Mason was broadcasting. His protective instincts, so carefully cultivated by Emma during their training sessions, told him that his human was in immediate danger. "Easy, boy," Bobby whispered, his hand steady on Ranger's neck, even as his own heart began to race. "We're going to be okay. Just stay calm." But calm was becoming impossible as Mason's agitation reached a breaking point. The officer had drawn his taser now, the weapon's distinctive shape causing several people in the crowd to gasp audibly. Cell phones lifted higher, their cameras focused on what was clearly about to become a confrontation that would define this moment for everyone present. "Back in my day," Bobby said quietly, more to himself than to Mason, "we didn't abandon our own." The words carried the weight of a man who had seen too much senseless conflict, who understood that some battles weren't worth fighting but had to be fought anyway because the alternative was surrender. Mason heard the comment as defiance, another example of this stubborn old man's refusal to acknowledge legitimate authority. What he didn't understand was that Bobby wasn't being defiant. He was being protective of the last living connection to his granddaughter, the final thread that tied him to a world that still held meaning. The taser's safety clicked off with a sound that seemed to echo off the surrounding buildings. Ranger's massive body tensed, every muscle coiled with the potential for explosive movement. The bull weighed 800 pounds and possessed the strength to easily overpower any human, but his training held him in check. Emma's voice seemed to whisper across the years, "Gentle, Ranger. Always gentle. Officer, please." Bobby tried one last time, his voice carrying a note of desperation that hadn't been there before. "You don't understand what you're about to do." Mason's finger found the trigger. Around them, the crowd held its collective breath. Cell phone cameras recorded every second, preparing to capture whatever happened next for the judgment of the world. In that frozen moment before violence erupted, nobody could have predicted that rescue was already racing toward them down Highway 9, or that the truth behind Bobby and Ranger's partnership would soon shatter everything this small Montana town thought it knew about love, loss, and the bonds that hold broken hearts together. The taser fired with a sharp crack that would echo in everyone's memory forever. The first taser barb struck Ranger in his massive shoulder, 50,000 volts coursing through his body like liquid fire. The bull's bellow of pain and confusion echoed off the storefronts of Main Street, a sound that would haunt the nightmares of everyone who witnessed it. His 800-pound frame buckled, muscles seizing as the electrical current disrupted every nerve pathway. But even as he fell, Ranger's training held. Instead of collapsing toward Bobby, potentially crushing the blind man beneath his weight, the bull managed to direct his fall away from his human companion. Bobby felt the harness jerk violently in his hands as Ranger went down. The sound of his partner's distress sent a spike of pure terror through him, triggering memories of mortar rounds and screaming men in a jungle halfway around the world. "Ranger!" he screamed, dropping his white cane as he fell to his knees beside the convulsing bull. His weathered hands found the animal's massive neck, searching desperately for a pulse beneath the coarse black hair. "Please, somebody help him. He's not dangerous. He's my partner." But Officer Mason wasn't finished. The sight of the old man kneeling beside what he still perceived as a dangerous animal triggered every protocol he'd been taught about controlling situations before they escalated further. In his mind, Bobby was still connected to a potential threat, still a problem that needed to be neutralized completely. The second taser discharge struck Bobby directly in the chest. The 72-year-old veteran's body convulsed as the electrical charge sent him into seizures beside his fallen companion. The crowd's reaction was immediate and visceral. Gasps of horror, screams of protest, the sound of dozens of phones capturing every moment of what was clearly an excessive use of force against a disabled veteran and his animal companion. "Jesus Christ, Mason!" Officer Sarah Rodriguez, who had just arrived as backup, pushed through the crowd with her radio already in hand. "What the hell are you doing?" She knelt beside Bobby, checking his pulse while speaking urgently into her radio. "Dispatch, I need EMTs at Main and 4th immediately. Officer-involved incident with a disabled civilian and service animal." Mason stood frozen, taser still extended, watching in growing horror as both the blind veteran and his bull lay motionless on the sidewalk. This wasn't how it was supposed to happen. He'd followed protocol for dealing with aggressive animals and non-compliant civilians. The fact that it had resulted in this scene, a disabled veteran and his companion animal writhing in pain while dozens of people recorded everything, made his stomach lurch with the realization that his career was over. The crowd's murmur had transformed into outright condemnation. "You tased a blind man," an elderly woman accused, pushing closer to the scene. "And his guide animal. What kind of person does that?" "I got it all on video," another witness announced, holding up his phone. "This is going viral. The whole world's going to see what you did." Maggie Hayes was the first to reach Bobby, her librarian's composure cracking as she knelt beside the man who had become like family to her over the past 2 years. "Bobby, honey, can you hear me?" she whispered, her voice breaking as she watched him struggle to regain consciousness. His lips were moving, but no sound was coming out except for weak gasps. Dr. Sarah Thompson had pushed through the crowd, her veterinary bag already in hand as she approached Ranger's massive form. The bull was conscious but barely responsive, his breathing shallow and irregular. "Someone call my clinic," she ordered, her hands moving expertly over the animal's body, checking for signs of cardiac distress or neurological damage. "Tell them to prepare for electrical shock treatment on a large bovine." Bobby's hand was groping blindly across the concrete, searching for Ranger's familiar presence. When his fingers finally found the bull's warm flank, tears began streaming down his weathered cheeks. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I'm so sorry they hurt you, boy." The sound of approaching sirens filled the air. Ambulance, fire department, and what sounded like additional police units. Word was already spreading through Willowbrook's tight-knit community via text messages and social media posts. The incident had been live-streamed on Facebook, and the video was being shared at an exponential rate. Justice for Bobby was already trending locally, with people demanding answers about why a blind veteran and his guide animal had been subjected to such treatment. Mason's radio crackled with the voice of Chief Patricia Williams, her tone leaving no doubt about her opinion of the situation. "Mason, what's your status? I'm getting calls from the mayor, the press, and half the damn town." I responded to a complaint about a dangerous animal," Mason stammered into his radio, but even as he spoke the words, he could hear how inadequate they sounded. The subject was non-compliant and the animal was showing aggressive behavior. Rodriguez shot him a look of pure disgust. Aggressive behavior? That bull was protecting his handler just like any trained animal would do, and the man is blind, for God's sake. How was he non-compliant? The EMTs arrived with practiced efficiency, immediately splitting into 2 teams, one for Bobby, one for Ranger. The human medical team worked quickly to stabilize the veteran, whose age and existing health conditions made the taser's effects potentially life-threatening. The veterinary emergency team, working with Dr. Thompson, began assessing Ranger's condition with equipment specifically designed for large animals. "Pulse is weak but steady," reported the lead EMT working on Bobby. "Blood pressure's elevated, but that's expected after electrical shock." "Sir, can you tell me your name?" Bobby's eyes fluttered open, though they focused on nothing. "Bobby Mitchell," he whispered hoarsely. "Is Ranger okay? Please tell me he's okay." Dr. Thompson looked up from her examination of the bull. "He's stable. The electrical shock caused some muscle trauma, but his heart rhythm is strong. He's going to need observation, but I think he'll recover fully." The relief that washed over Bobby's face was visible to everyone present. Even in his own pain and confusion, his primary concern was for his companion. It was a moment that spoke volumes about the relationship between them, a bond that went far deeper than the utilitarian connection between a disabled person and their assistive device. As the medical teams prepared to transport both Bobby and Ranger to their respective treatment facilities, the crowd began to disperse, but the damage to the community's trust had already been done. People were angry, not just about the specific incident, but about what it represented. Here was a veteran who had given his sight in service to his country, living quietly in their community, asking for nothing more than the right to walk down Main Street with his companion. And he had been treated like a criminal. Mrs. Henderson, the woman whose complaint had started the whole incident, stood near the bank entrance with the expression of growing unease. The satisfaction she'd felt when the police car first arrived had curdled into something that felt uncomfortably like guilt. She'd wanted Bobby and his bull off the streets, but she hadn't wanted this. Nobody had wanted this. Chief Williams arrived on scene just as the ambulance was preparing to depart with Bobby. A woman in her 50s with 30 years of law enforcement experience, she took one look at the situation and began damage control. "Rodriguez, I want a full report on my desk within the hour. Mason, you're suspended pending investigation. Turn in your badge and weapon." Mason's face went pale. "Chief, I was following protocol." "You were following stupidity," Williams cut him off. "That man is a decorated veteran, and that animal has been walking these streets for 2 years without incident. Every person in this crowd knows it, every business owner knows it, and now the whole damn internet knows it because you couldn't use an ounce of common sense." As the ambulance carrying Bobby pulled away, followed by the large animal transport vehicle carrying Ranger, the scene on Main Street began to take on the quality of a vigil. People weren't leaving. Instead, they were gathering in small groups, talking in hushed tones about what they'd witnessed and what it meant for their community. Maggie Hayes found herself at the center of many conversations, people asking her about Bobby's background, his relationship with Ranger, and what could be done to help. Word was spreading about his financial situation, the medical bills, the impending foreclosure, the desperate circumstances that made Ranger not just a companion, but a lifeline. "We need to do something," said Jim Rodriguez from the hardware store. "That man's been through enough. He shouldn't have to worry about losing his ranch on top of everything else." Sarah Thompson was already on her phone with colleagues at the veterinary college, arranging for Ranger to receive the best possible care. "I'll cover all his medical expenses," she announced to anyone within earshot. "It's the least we can do." But even as the community began rallying around Bobby and Ranger, darker undercurrents were beginning to surface. Questions were being asked about Officer Mason's background, about why he'd transferred to Willowbrook, about whether there had been other incidents that suggested a pattern of poor judgment or excessive force. Mason himself sat in his patrol car, officially relieved of duty, watching as the town he'd served for less than a year turned against him. His radio was silent, his authority stripped away with the removal of his badge. For the first time since the incident began, he was forced to confront what he'd actually done. Not the sanitized version that would appear in his official report, but the raw truth of two innocent beings lying broken on the pavement because of his actions. In his pocket, his personal cell phone buzzed with text messages from his father in Arkansas. Somehow, Frank Mason had already seen the viral video. The messages were incoherent, drunken ramblings about consequences and what goes around, but they carried an undercurrent of something that made Derek's blood run cold. His father knew something about this situation that Derek didn't, something that would make an already catastrophic situation infinitely worse. The afternoon sun was beginning to cast long shadows down Main Street as the last of the emergency vehicles departed, leaving behind only the chalk outlines where Bobby and Ranger had fallen. But the story was far from over. In hospital rooms across town, both man and bull were fighting to recover from trauma that went far deeper than electrical shock. And in the community of Willowbrook, people were beginning to ask hard questions about justice, compassion, and what they owed to those who had sacrificed everything in service to others. The viral video would be seen by millions before the day was over, but the real reckoning was just beginning. The county courthouse in Willowbrook had never seen a crowd like this. By 8 in the morning, 2 hours before Bobby Mitchell's hearing was scheduled to begin, the parking lot was already full. News vans from 3 different television stations had claimed spots along the street. Their satellite dishes pointed skyward like technological prayers. People carried handmade signs reading "Justice for Bobby" and "Ranger is a hero," while others held photos of the viral video's most heart-wrenching moments. The old man's hand searching for his fallen companion, the massive bull refusing to leave his partner's side. Inside the courthouse, Bobby sat at the defendant's table beside his overwhelmed public defender, a young woman named Jessica Chen, who had graduated law school just 2 years earlier and had never handled a case with this level of media attention. Her client looked frail in his pressed khaki pants and navy button-down shirt, the same outfit he'd worn on the morning that changed everything. His weathered hands rested on the table, occasionally trembling from the lingering effects of electrical shock trauma. The gallery was packed beyond capacity, with overflow crowds watching on monitors in the hallway. Maggie Hayes sat in the front row, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, her expression fierce with protective loyalty. Dr. Sarah Thompson sat beside her, having closed her veterinary clinic for the day to attend the hearing. Jim Rodriguez and dozens of other Willowbrook residents filled the remaining seats, their faces reflecting a mixture of anger and determination. Judge Harold Peterson, a man in his 70s who had presided over this courthouse for more than 30 years, gavelled the session to order. This hearing concerns the charges filed against Robert Mitchell following the incident on Main Street 3 days ago. The defendant is charged with disorderly conduct, failure to comply with lawful police orders, and endangering public safety. District Attorney Michael Harrison stood to present the state's case, his voice carrying the bureaucratic detachment of a man who saw this as just another file on his desk. Your Honor, the defendant willfully disobeyed direct police orders to remove a dangerous animal from a public area. Despite repeated warnings, he refused to comply, creating a situation that required the use of force to protect public safety. A murmur of discontent rippled through the gallery. Someone in the back called out, "That's a lie!" before being quickly shushed by those around them. Bobby's public defender rose shakily to her feet. Your Honor, my client is a decorated Vietnam veteran who lost his sight in service to his country. The animal in question has been his companion for 2 years without a single incident. Mr. Mitchell was simply exercising his right to move freely in public spaces with his guide animal. Guide animal? D.A. Harrison interjected with obvious skepticism. Your Honor, we're talking about an 800-pound bull, not a trained service dog. There's no certification, no official documentation, no legitimate basis for claiming this animal serves any legitimate assistive function. Judge Peterson looked down at Bobby with the stern expression that had intimidated lawyers and defendants for decades. Mr. Mitchell, can you explain to this court why you believe a bull can serve as a guide animal? Bobby struggled to his feet, his public defender's hand on his arm for support. The courtroom fell silent as he turned his sightless eyes toward the judge's voice. When he spoke, his words carried the quiet dignity of a man who had faced far worse tribunals than this one. Your Honor, Ranger isn't just any bull. He was trained by my granddaughter Emma before she died 2 years ago. She spent months working with him, teaching him to guide me safely, to respond to commands, to protect me when I needed protection. That bull has more sense than most people I've met. Trained by your granddaughter? Judge Peterson's expression softened slightly. And where is this young woman now? Bobby's voice caught in his throat. She's dead, sir. Car accident on Highway 9. Drunk driver crossed the center line and took everything that mattered in my world. The courtroom was absolutely silent now, the weight of Bobby's loss settling over everyone present like a heavy blanket. Even D.A. Harrison shifted uncomfortably, his prosecutorial zeal dampened by the raw grief in the old man's voice. Maggie Hayes stood up in the gallery, unable to remain silent any longer. Your Honor, if I may, I've known Bobby Mitchell for 40 years. I've watched him walk down Main Street with Ranger every day for 2 years. That bull is the gentlest creature you've ever seen. He guides Bobby around obstacles, stops at curbs, even knows which businesses allow animals inside. Emma Mitchell trained that animal better than most professional dog trainers could have managed. Judge Peterson looked at the packed gallery, then back at Bobby. Mr. Mitchell, you understand that regardless of your personal circumstances, the law requires certain standards for service animals. There are safety considerations, insurance liabilities. I understand the law, Your Honor, Bobby interrupted quietly. But I also understand what it means to lose everything twice. I lost my sight in Vietnam, and I lost my granddaughter on Highway 9. Ranger is all I have left of Emma. He's all I have left of anything. Dr. Thompson stood up from her seat. Your Honor, I'm Dr. Sarah Thompson, Willowbrook's veterinarian. I've examined Ranger multiple times over the past 2 years. That animal is remarkably intelligent and uncommonly gentle. I've seen certified service dogs with less training and worse temperament. If we're talking about public safety, I'd trust Ranger around children before I'd trust most pets. The testimony continued for another hour, with character witnesses describing Bobby's contributions to the community, his quiet dignity in the face of overwhelming medical bills and personal loss. The viral video was played multiple times, with expert witnesses analyzing the incident frame by frame. But it was Bobby's final statement that brought many in the courtroom to tears. Your Honor, he said, rising once more to his feet with obvious effort, I know I'm not perfect. I know that having Ranger as my guide isn't conventional. But that bull saved my life in more ways than one. When Emma died, I wanted to die too. I had nothing left to live for. But Ranger needed me, and I needed him. He gave me a reason to get up in the morning, a way to feel useful again. Bobby's voice grew stronger as he continued. I'm not asking this court to change the law. I'm asking for understanding. That bull isn't just an animal to me. He's my connection to the granddaughter I lost, my link to a world I can no longer see. When Officer Mason attacked us, he wasn't just enforcing regulations. He was severing the last thread connecting me to everything I've ever loved. The old man's legs gave out then, and he collapsed back into his chair, his face pale with exhaustion and emotion. The courtroom erupted in supportive murmurs and some scattered applause before Judge Peterson restored order with his gavel. This court will recess for deliberation, the judge announced. We'll reconvene in 1 hour for my decision. As the courtroom emptied for the break, Bobby remained seated at the defendant's table, his head in his hands. The stress of the hearing, combined with his still recovering body, had pushed him to his physical and emotional limits. Jessica Chen sat beside him, unsure how to comfort a man who had endured so much loss. Outside the courthouse, the crowd had grown larger. Local news crews were interviewing supporters, while social media continued to amplify the story. Justice for Bobby had spread beyond Willowbrook, gaining national attention as a symbol of the struggles faced by disabled veterans. Donations were pouring into a GoFundMe account that Maggie had set up to help with Bobby's medical bills and legal expenses. But even as public support swelled, darker currents were stirring beneath the surface. Officer Derek Mason sat in his apartment, suspended from duty and facing his own legal troubles. His phone had been ringing constantly. Reporters, lawyers, and most disturbingly, his father Frank calling from Arkansas with increasingly incoherent messages. The most recent voicemail had been different from the others, less drunk but more frightening. "Derek, boy, you need to know something about that old man, about his granddaughter, about what really happened on Highway 9. Call me back before you do something else stupid." Mason stared at his phone, dread growing in his stomach like a cancer. His father's drinking had destroyed their family, cost him his job, and driven Derek to law enforcement as a way of distancing himself from the chaos. But now it seemed that chaos was following him to Montana. When court reconvened, Judge Peterson's expression was grave. "This case has forced me to consider not just the letter of the law, but its spirit. Mr. Mitchell, while I cannot officially recognize a bull as a certified service animal, I also cannot ignore the testimony about Ranger's exemplary behavior and your obvious bond with him." The judge paused, looking out over the packed courtroom. "The charges of disorderly conduct and failure to comply are dismissed. However, I must address the public safety concerns. Effective immediately, you and Ranger will need to undergo evaluation by a certified animal behaviorist. If Ranger passes assessment for temperament and training, I'll allow him to continue serving as your companion with certain restrictions." The courtroom erupted in cheers, but Judge Peterson wasn't finished. "Furthermore, I'm ordering the Willowbrook Police Department to undergo mandatory training on disability rights and proper procedures for interacting with service animals. What happened on Main Street should never happen again in my jurisdiction." Bobby sat motionless for a moment, overwhelmed by relief and exhaustion. Then, slowly, tears began streaming down his weathered cheeks. Not tears of sadness this time, but of gratitude for a community that had rallied around him when he needed them most. But even as victory was declared in the courthouse, the real story was just beginning to unfold. In a motel room across town, Derek Mason's father was driving north on Highway 9, carrying secrets that would shatter everything Bobby thought he knew about Emma's death and the bull that had become his salvation. The truth was coming to Willowbrook, and it would change everything once again. 3 days after the courthouse victory, Bobby Mitchell sat in his kitchen staring at foreclosure papers that had arrived in the morning mail. The euphoria of Judge Peterson's decision had faded into the harsh reality of numbers that didn't lie. 48 hours until the bank seized his 40-acre ranch. The GoFundMe campaign had raised $12,000, enough to cover some medical expenses and legal fees, but nowhere near the amount needed to save his home. Ranger stood beside his chair, the bull's massive head resting against Bobby's shoulder in the gentle way that had become their private language of comfort. The animal had recovered fully from the taser incident, but something had changed in his demeanor. Where once he had moved through the world with quiet confidence, now he seemed hypervigilant, his intelligent eyes constantly scanning for threats that might emerge from any direction. "We might have won the battle, boy," Bobby said softly, his fingers finding the familiar comfort of Ranger's coarse neck hair. "But we're losing the war." The phone rang, its shrill tone cutting through the afternoon silence. Bobby's hand trembled slightly as he reached for the receiver, half expecting another reporter or well-wisher whose sympathy couldn't pay his debts. "Mr. Mitchell?" The voice was unfamiliar, gravelly with age and something that might have been alcohol. "This is Frank Mason, Derek Mason's father. I need to talk to you." Bobby's grip tightened on the phone. The name Mason sent a spike of anger through his chest, memories of the taser's electricity still fresh in his nervous system. "I don't have anything to say to anyone named Mason." "Wait." Frank's voice carried a desperate urgency. "Please, it's about Emma. It's about what really happened on Highway 9. The mention of his granddaughter's name hit Bobby like a physical blow. His breathing stopped, the kitchen seeming to tilt around him as memories of that terrible night came flooding back. The phone call from the hospital, the drive through darkness to identify a body that had once been his beautiful Emma. The drunk driver who had walked away from the accident with minor injuries while Bobby's world burned to ashes. What about Emma? Bobby's voice was barely a whisper. "I was the one driving the car," Frank Mason said, and the words hung in the air like a death sentence. "I was the drunk son of a bitch who killed your granddaughter." Bobby's hand went numb, the phone slipping from his grasp and clattering onto the kitchen table. Ranger immediately pressed closer, sensing his human's distress with the intuitive understanding that had been trained into him during those precious months with Emma. The bull's warm presence was the only thing keeping Bobby anchored to reality as the room spun around him. With shaking fingers, Bobby retrieved the phone. "What did you say?" "I said I killed her." Frank's voice was thick with tears and alcohol. 2 years ago, September 15th. I'd been drinking at Murphy's Bar in Billings, lost my job, lost my wife, figured I had nothing left to lose. But I was wrong. I had my son's respect to lose, and Emma Mitchell's life to take. Bobby closed his eyes, but the darkness behind his lids offered no escape from the images Frank's words conjured. Emma's twisted car, the emergency room, the funeral where he'd stood beside a grave that should have been his own. "Why are you telling me this?" Bobby asked, his voice hollow. "Because my boy Derek recognized your voice in court. He called me, said he'd arrested some old man with a bull, and when he described you, I knew who you were, and I knew what I'd done to your family." Frank's breathing was labored, punctuated by what sounded like sobs. "Derek don't know yet. He transferred to Montana to get away from my mess, and I followed it right to his doorstep." Bobby felt something crack inside his chest, a sound like ice breaking on a frozen lake. All this time, he'd thought the confrontation with Officer Mason had been random, a case of mistaken assumptions and poor training. But it had been connected to Emma's death, connected to the drunk driver who had destroyed everything Bobby held dear. "Your son attacked me because of what you did," Bobby said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "No," Frank replied quickly. "Derek don't know about Emma. He knows I had an accident, knows I lost my license and my job, but he don't know I killed someone. He attacked you because he's carrying my shame without even knowing what it is. That boy's been trying to prove he's better than his old man his whole life, and I keep pulling him down into my gutter." Ranger sensed the change in Bobby's emotional state and moved closer, his massive bulk pressing against the old man's legs with patient strength. The bull's presence was steady, reliable, a living reminder that some bonds could survive even the worst betrayals of fate. "She was coming home from the county fair," Bobby said, his voice distant with memory. "First place ribbon for training ranger. She called me from the fairgrounds, so excited she could barely talk. Said she had something special to show me when she got home." "I know," Frank whispered. "I read about it in the papers. Read about how she'd trained that bull, how proud you were of her. Made it worse somehow, knowing she was somebody's everything." Bobby sat in silence. the weight of this revelation crushing down on him like physical pressure. Emma's death hadn't been random after all. It had been caused by a man whose son would later attack Bobby and Ranger in an unconscious acting out of inherited guilt. The cosmic cruelty of it was almost too much to comprehend. "What do you want from me?" Bobby asked finally. "I want to make it right," Frank said. "I know I can't bring her back. I know I can't undo what I did to your family. But I've got some money saved up, and I heard about your ranch, about the foreclosure." Bobby's anger flared hot and immediate. "You think you can buy your way out of this? You think money can replace Emma?" "No," Frank replied, his voice steady for the first time in the conversation. "But it might save the ranch she loved, might keep Ranger in the home she trained him for. I can't give you back your granddaughter, but I can maybe keep from taking away what's left of her legacy." The offer hung between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm. Bobby's practical mind recognized the salvation being offered. Enough money to save the ranch, to keep Ranger safe, to preserve the last physical connection to Emma's memory. But his heart recoiled from accepting anything from the man who had destroyed his world. "I need time to think," Bobby said finally. "I don't have much time," Frank replied. "Doctor says my liver's giving out. 6 months if I stop drinking, less if I don't. And we both know I ain't stopping. This might be my last chance to do something decent." After hanging up, Bobby sat motionless in his kitchen as shadows lengthened across the worn linoleum floor. Ranger remained beside him, patient and protective, occasionally nudging his hand as if to remind him that he wasn't alone in this impossible decision. The moral complexity was staggering. Accept money from Emma's killer and save the ranch she had loved, or refuse and lose everything she had worked to preserve. Either choice felt like a betrayal of her memory. Either path led through territories of compromise and complicity that Bobby had never imagined having to navigate. Outside, he could hear the familiar sounds of rural Montana evening. Cattle calling across distant pastures, the whisper of wind through dry grass, the steady rhythm of life continuing despite the chaos that had invaded his world. These were the sounds Emma had grown up with, the soundtrack to a childhood spent training animals and dreaming of futures that would never come. Bobby's hand found Ranger's neck again, drawing strength from the bull's unwavering presence. Emma had given her life for this animal, had died coming home to show Bobby what love and dedication could accomplish. Now that same animal was all Bobby had left, and the money to keep him safe was being offered by the very man who had taken Emma away. The phone rang again. This time, Bobby knew, he would have to decide whether justice mattered more than survival, whether Emma's memory was better served by moral purity or practical preservation of everything she had held dear. His hand hovered over the receiver as Ranger pressed closer, waiting with infinite patience for whatever came next. Bobby's hands shook as he opened the manila envelope that had arrived by overnight courier. Inside were documents that would change everything: bank drafts, property transfers, and a handwritten letter on paper that smelled faintly of cigarettes and desperation. Frank Mason had kept his word with the efficiency of a dying man who understood that time was his enemy. The amount was staggering, $850,000, enough to pay off the ranch's mortgage with money left over for years of comfortable living. But attached to the bank draft was a photograph that made Bobby's blood run cold. Emma's mangled car on Highway 9, taken by the state trooper who had worked the accident scene. On the back, in Frank's unsteady handwriting, were the words, "So you never forget what my drinking cost your family." Ranger stood beside Bobby's kitchen chair, his massive head tilted with the intuitive understanding that something momentous was happening. The bull's dark eyes seemed to reflect a wisdom beyond his species, as if Emma's training had imparted not just commands and responses, but something deeper, a connection to the emotional undercurrents that governed human behavior. The letter itself was 3 pages of barely legible confession, written in the wavering script of a man whose hands had been destroyed by decades of alcohol abuse. Frank Mason had poured out every detail of that September night 2 years ago, the fight with his ex-wife, the bottle of whiskey consumed at Murphy's bar, the decision to drive home despite knowing better. He described the impact, the sound of crushing metal, the way Emma's car had spun off the highway like a broken toy. "I stayed conscious long enough to see her," Frank had written. "Beautiful girl, probably your age when you were young. She was still breathing when the paramedics got there, kept saying something about a bull, about getting home to show her grandfather what she'd accomplished. The doctor said she might have lived if the ambulance had gotten there 5 minutes sooner. 5 minutes I stole from her by being drunk and stupid and selfish." Bobby set the letter down with trembling fingers, his sightless eyes streaming tears that had been building for 2 years. All this time, he'd carried the guilt of Emma's final moments, imagining her dying alone and afraid on that dark highway. To learn that she'd been thinking of him, of Ranger, of the joy she'd planned to share, it was both a blessing and a torment that threatened to break what remained of his heart. The kitchen door opened with the familiar creak that announced Maggie Hayes's arrival. She'd been coming by daily since the courthouse hearing, bringing groceries and companionship to a man who had isolated himself from the world's kindness for too long. "Bobby?" Her voice carried the gentle concern that had become her signature over the past week. "I saw the courier truck. Is everything all right?" Bobby couldn't speak, couldn't find words to explain the moral earthquake that was reshaping the landscape of his grief. Instead, he held up the bank draft with shaking fingers, letting the numbers speak for themselves. Maggie's sharp intake of breath told him she understood the magnitude of what he was holding. "Where did this come from?" "Frank Mason," Bobby said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Derek Mason's father, the drunk driver who killed Emma." The silence that followed was so complete that Bobby could hear Ranger's steady breathing, the tick of the kitchen clock, the distant sound of cattle moving across the pasture Emma had loved. When Maggie finally spoke, her voice carried a weight of understanding that only another person who had lost everything could provide. "Oh, Bobby, what are you going to do?" "I don't know," he admitted. "Taking this money feels like betraying Emma's memory. But losing the ranch means losing everything she worked for, everything she loved." Maggie pulled out a kitchen chair and sat down, her presence adding warmth to the cold equations of guilt and necessity that were paralyzing Bobby's decision-making process. "What do you think Emma would want you to do?" Bobby's laugh was bitter, edged with the hysteria of a man pushed beyond his emotional limits. "Emma would want to be alive. She'd want to show me how well she'd trained Ranger, how proud she was of their partnership. She'd want to go to college, get married, have children who could run through these pastures the way she did." "But she can't have those things," Maggie said gently. "So what would she want for you?" "What would she want for Ranger?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre, forcing Bobby to confront truths he'd been avoiding since the moment Emma died. His granddaughter had been practical despite her youth, understanding that love sometimes required difficult choices. She'd trained Ranger not for her own benefit, but as a gift to the grandfather who had raised her after her parents died in a factory explosion when she was 7. "She'd want Ranger to be safe," Bobby said finally. "She'd want the ranch to survive. She'd want her work to mean something." "Then maybe this isn't about forgiveness," Maggie suggested. "Maybe it's about transformation, taking something terrible and turning it into something that honors Emma's memory." Before Bobby could respond, the sound of gravel crunching in his driveway announced another visitor. Ranger's posture immediately shifted to high alert, his protective instincts activated by the approach of an unfamiliar vehicle. Bobby heard a car door slam, followed by unsteady footsteps that spoke of either injury or intoxication. The knock on the kitchen door was tentative, almost apologetic. When Bobby opened it, he found himself face to face with Derek Mason for the first time since the tasing incident. The young officer looked haggard, his uniform replaced by civilian clothes that hung loosely on his diminished frame. "Mr. Mitchell," Derek's voice carried the weight of sleepless nights and moral reckoning. "I need to talk to you. It's about my father." Bobby stepped aside, allowing Derek to enter the kitchen where Maggie and Ranger waited in tense silence. The bull's eyes tracked the younger Mason's every movement, remembering the violence that had passed between them on Main Street. "Easy, Ranger," Bobby said quietly. "He's not here to hurt us." Derek's gaze fell on the bank draft lying open on the kitchen table, and his face went pale with understanding. "He told you, didn't he?" "About Emma." "He told me he killed her," Bobby said, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions churning in his chest. "He told me you didn't know." Derek collapsed into a chair as if his legs could no longer support the weight of his family's sins. "I knew he'd been in an accident, knew he'd lost his license, lost his job, but he said it was just property damage, said nobody got hurt. I've been trying to redeem his reputation my whole career, and all the time you were the son of a killer," Bobby finished. "And when you heard my voice in court, some part of you recognized it from the night Emma died." Derek nodded miserably. "I was the responding officer that night. Heard you screaming in the emergency room, heard you talking to the doctors about Emma's training project, about how proud you were of her work with Ranger. When I attacked you on Main Street, it wasn't random. Some part of me knew exactly who you were." The revelation added another layer of complexity to an already impossible situation. Derek Mason wasn't just the officer who had abused his authority, he was also the first responder who had witnessed Bobby's grief on the worst night of his life. "What do you want from me?" Bobby asked. "Nothing," Derek replied. "I don't deserve anything from you. I came to resign my commission, to tell you that I'm leaving Willowbrook. My presence here is just another reminder of what my family took from you." Maggie, who had remained silent throughout this exchange, finally spoke up. "Running away won't fix anything. It won't bring Emma back, and it won't undo what happened on Main Street." "Then what will?" Derek's voice broke with the desperation of a man drowning in inherited guilt. Bobby sat quietly for a long moment, his hand resting on Ranger's neck as he processed everything he'd learned. The bull's steady presence helped ground him, reminding him that some relationships transcended the complexities of human morality. Emma had trained Ranger to be loyal, protective, and forgiving. Perhaps those were the qualities Bobby needed to cultivate in himself. "You want to make amends?" Bobby asked finally. "Then help me turn your father's money into something that honors Emma's memory. Help me create something she would have been proud of." Derek looked up with confused hope. "What do you mean?" "Emma loved training animals, loved the connection between humans and creatures that most people dismiss as dumb beasts. Your father's money could fund a training center, a place where other kids could learn what Emma knew about working with livestock, about building partnerships that transcend species." The idea had formed as Bobby spoke, crystallizing into something that felt both practical and sacred. Emma's work with Ranger had proven that conventional limitations could be overcome through patience, dedication, and love. A training center in her name could ensure that her innovations wouldn't die with her. "The Emma Mitchell Memorial Training Center," Maggie said, her voice warm with approval. "Teaching young people how to work with large animals, how to build the kinds of partnerships that most people think are impossible." Derek's eyes filled with tears. "You'd do that? You'd take blood money and turn it into something beautiful?" "Not blood money," Bobby corrected. "Redemption money. Your father can't bring Emma back, but he can ensure that her work continues. And you can help make it happen, if you have the courage to face what your family did instead of running from it." Ranger moved closer to Bobby, pressing his massive head against the old man's shoulder in the gesture of comfort that had become their private language. The bull seemed to understand that something fundamental had shifted in the room, that the atmosphere of grief and guilt was transforming into something resembling hope. "There's one condition," Bobby said, looking directly at Derek despite his blindness. "You stay in Willowbrook. You help build this center, and you face the people you've wronged. Running away is the easy choice. Staying and doing the work of redemption, that's what your father should have done 2 years ago." Derek nodded through his tears, understanding that he was being offered something more valuable than forgiveness. He was being given the chance to transform his family's legacy of destruction into something constructive. Outside, the Montana sunset was painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the same colors that had filled Emma's world on the last evening of her life. But inside Bobby's kitchen, the conversation had turned to plans and possibilities, to the practical details of turning tragedy into triumph. The bank draft still lay on the table, but it no longer seemed like blood money. It had become seed money, the foundation for something that would ensure Emma's innovations with animal training would benefit future generations. Frank Mason's guilt could be transformed into Emma Mitchell's legacy if Bobby had the courage to accept the gift and the responsibility it represented. Ranger settled at Bobby's feet, his massive bulk radiating contentment and approval. The bull understood in the wordless way that connected them that his training would not be wasted, that Emma's work would continue through the children who would learn her methods at the center bearing her name. For the first time since Emma's death, Bobby Mitchell felt something approaching peace. 6 months later, Bobby Mitchell stood at the edge of what had once been Emma's favorite pasture, listening to the sounds of construction that filled the Montana air with promise. The Emma Mitchell Memorial Training Center was taking shape with remarkable speed, funded not only by Frank Mason's money, but by donations that had poured in from across the country after the story went national. The viral video that had once represented his lowest moment had become a catalyst for something beautiful. Ranger pressed against his side, the bull's presence as steady and reassuring as it had been through every trial of the past year. The massive animal wore a new halter now, custom-made leather with brass plates that read "Emma's Legacy" in elegant script. Children from the local 4-H clubs had insisted on the inscription, understanding, in the way that only young people could, that some stories needed to be preserved in metal and memory. "Mr. Mitchell?" a young voice called from the direction of the main building. Bobby turned toward the sound, recognizing the eager tone of Katie Rodriguez, Jim's 12-year-old daughter, who had become the training center's most enthusiastic volunteer. "What is it, Katie?" Bobby asked, smiling at the girl's boundless energy. She reminded him of Emma at that age, full of questions and completely fearless around animals that towered over her small frame. "The reporter from the Helena paper is here for the interview," Katie announced. "And Derek wanted to know if you're ready for the ribbon-cutting ceremony." Bobby nodded, straightening his tie with the careful precision of a man who had learned to dress by touch alone. Today was the official opening of the training center, exactly 2 years and 3 months after Emma's death. The timing wasn't coincidental. Bobby had insisted that the center open on what would have been her 19th birthday. Derek Mason approached across the pasture, his footsteps confident in a way they hadn't been during those dark days after the Main Street incident. The former police officer had found his redemption in hard work and honest labor, overseeing the construction project with the dedication of a man determined to build something worthy of forgiveness. His relationship with Bobby had evolved from antagonism through guilt to something approaching genuine friendship, forged in the shared understanding that some wounds could only heal through service to others. "The crowd's bigger than we expected," Derek reported. "Mayor Williams is here, along with delegations from 3 other counties. The State Agricultural Extension Office sent their youth development coordinator, and he paused, his voice carrying a note of nervous excitement. My father's here. Bobby's expression grew serious. Frank Mason had been sober for 4 months now, his liver disease providing the motivation that years of family pleas had failed to achieve. The dying man's transformation had been remarkable, trading alcohol for a desperate attempt to create something good from the wreckage of his life. But this would be the first time he and Bobby had met face to face since that terrible September night 2 years ago. How does he look? Bobby asked. Like a man who knows he's dying, Derek replied honestly, but also like a man who's finally proud of his son. He keeps staring at the building, at Emma's name over the entrance. I think seeing her name there, knowing that his money helped create this place, it's the first peace he's had since the accident. Maggie Hayes joined their group, her arms full of the ribbons and scissors needed for the ceremonial opening. At 70, she had thrown herself into the training center project with the enthusiasm of someone who had found new purpose in preserving Emma's legacy. She had become the center's unofficial historian, collecting stories and photographs that documented Emma's remarkable relationship with animals. The photographer wants pictures of you and Ranger with the building in the background, she informed Bobby. And then we'll do the ribbon cutting with the whole community present. Katie's going to read Emma's essay about animal training, the one she wrote for her senior English project. Bobby nodded, feeling the weight of the moment settling around him like a comfortable blanket. The training center represented more than just Emma's memory. It had become a symbol of how tragedy could be transformed into triumph through the persistent application of love and determination. As they walked toward the main building, Bobby could hear the murmur of the gathered crowd, the excitement of children who had come to see the animals, the respectful tones of adults who understood they were witnessing something historically significant. The Emma Mitchell Memorial Training Center was the first facility in the state specifically designed to teach young people how to work with large animals as companions rather than just livestock. The building itself was beautiful in its simplicity. A large barn-style structure with modern amenities, but traditional lines that honored the agricultural heritage of the region. Emma's photograph, enlarged to poster size, dominated the entrance lobby, showing her at 16 with Ranger as a young calf, both of them beaming with the joy of successful partnership. Nervous? Derek asked as they approached the ribbon stretched across the main entrance. Bobby considered the question seriously. No, he said finally. Emma would have loved this. She would have been proud to see her work continuing, to know that other kids will learn what she discovered about the bonds between humans and animals. Frank Mason stood near the back of the crowd, his gaunt frame supported by a walker that spoke of his body's gradual surrender to decades of abuse. When Bobby approached the ribbon, Frank stepped forward, his voice barely audible above the crowd's chatter. Mr. Mitchell, Frank said, each word carefully chosen, I wanted to thank you for taking my money and turning it into something beautiful, for giving my son a chance to redeem himself, for showing me that forgiveness doesn't always look the way you expect it to. Bobby extended his hand, and Frank took it with fingers that trembled from more than just illness. The handshake lasted only a moment, but it carried the weight of 2 years' worth of grief, guilt, and gradual healing. Emma would have wanted this, Bobby said simply. She believed in second chances, even for people who didn't think they deserved them. Katie Rodriguez stepped forward with a microphone, her young voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, before we cut the ribbon, I'd like to read from an essay that Emma Mitchell wrote just a few months before she died. It's called Why Animals Make the Best Teachers. The crowd fell silent as Katie began to read Emma's words, her voice growing stronger with each sentence. People think animals are simple, but they're wrong. Animals are honest in ways that humans rarely are. They don't lie about their feelings, they don't pretend to be something they're not, and they don't hold grudges. When you work with an animal, you learn to communicate without words, to trust without guarantees, to love without conditions. Bobby felt tears streaming down his cheeks as Emma's voice seemed to speak through Katie's reading. Ranger pressed closer, the bull's massive head resting against Bobby's shoulder in the gesture of comfort that had sustained them both through the darkest times. The best part about working with animals, Katie continued, reading Emma's words, is that they see past all the things that make humans judge each other. They don't care if you're rich or poor, young or old, perfect or broken. They care about whether you're patient, whether you're kind, and whether you keep your promises. In a world full of complicated relationships, animals offer something simple and pure: the chance to love and be loved exactly as you are. The essay concluded with Emma's hope that someday she could teach others what she had learned about the profound connections possible between humans and animals. As Katie folded the pages, the silence that followed was filled with the soft sounds of people wiping away tears. Mayor Williams stepped forward to say a few words about community resilience and the power of transforming tragedy into hope. Dr. Thompson spoke about the scientific value of Emma's training methods and the research possibilities the center would enable. Derek Mason, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes, talked about redemption and the importance of facing the consequences of our actions. Finally, it was Bobby's turn to speak. He stood beside the ribbon, Ranger at his side, feeling the attention of the crowd like sunlight on his face. Emma always said that the best teachers are the ones who show us possibilities we never imagined, he began. She showed me that a bull could be a companion, that love could transcend species, that hope could survive even the darkest tragedies. This training center isn't just about teaching young people to work with animals. It's about teaching them to see possibilities where others see obstacles, to find connections where others see differences. Bobby paused, his hand finding Ranger's neck with the automatic gesture that had become second nature. Emma's not here to see this day, but her spirit is in every brick of this building, in every lesson that will be taught here, in every young person who will discover what she knew about the bonds between humans and animals. He raised the scissors, his movements guided by Derek's gentle hand on his wrist. Today we open the Emma Mitchell Memorial Training Center, not just as a monument to one remarkable girl, but as a promise that her work will continue, that her discoveries will benefit generations of young people who share her vision of what's possible when we open our hearts to the lessons animals have to teach us. The ribbon fell in two pieces, and the crowd erupted in applause. Children rushed forward to see the animals, adults moved toward the reception area, and Bobby stood quietly in the center of it all, feeling Emma's presence as strongly as if she were standing right beside him. Ranger seemed to sense the significance of the moment. The massive bull lifted his head and let out a long, low call that echoed across the pastures, not a moo of distress or hunger, but something that sounded remarkably like a song of celebration. The Emma Mitchell Memorial Training Center was officially open, and Emma's legacy was secure. Sometimes the most profound healing comes not from forgetting our losses, but from transforming them into legacies that outlive our pain. Bobby Mitchell's journey from a broken veteran facing foreclosure to the founder of a training center that touches countless lives reminds us that our darkest chapters can become the foundation for our most meaningful contributions. When we lose the people we love most, our spouses, our children, our grandchildren, we face a choice between bitter isolation and purposeful connection. Bobby chose connection, turning his granddaughter Emma's memory into a living testament that teaches young people about the extraordinary bonds possible between humans and animals. His story proves that even at 72, even after losing everything that mattered, we can still build something beautiful from the wreckage. The Bull Ranger wasn't just Bobby's guide through physical darkness, he became the bridge between crushing grief and renewed purpose. In our golden years, when society often views us as finished chapters rather than continuing stories, Bobby's transformation shows us that our greatest impact might still be ahead of us. True happiness isn't the absence of sorrow. It's the decision to let our scars become sources of strength for others who walk similar paths. What loss in your life could become a legacy that helps others? How might your own struggles become the foundation for something meaningful in your community? Share your thoughts below. Your story matters more than you know.